It's a great deal of pleasure for us to have Burton here at Blackstone. And it's my privilege and pleasure to give you Burton at this time. Burton, you come on up here.
Thank you very much, Dave. You know, you don't come into AA and be in AA very long unless you hear about Blackstone. And certainly in my life it hasn't been any exception. About the middle of the summer, or the latter part of the summer, Dave called me and said Tom asked him to call him and call me and see if I wouldn't come up here and talk. Well, he knew I would before he called me. And then Tom would write me a letter. Well, I finally got a letter from Tom, and not only invited me, but he invited my wife. And I wrote him back and I said, Tom, I don't know whether you know how much money it costs to send two people from Texas, much less one, you know. But he assured me that this was a custom, that the speakers bring their wife. I don't know whether it's compulsory or not. I was afraid to ask. I haven't got anything against bringing your wives along to these conventions. I think it's nice. Kind of like going hunting with the game warden, but it's real nice. And so Florence got to come, and so we are grateful, and you've been so good to us. We've never been to Virginia before, but then so many things have happened since we've been here. Everyone that comes from Blackstone carries one of the most beautiful messages, and even to the extent it's awfully hard to describe in their imagination in words what it is that Blackstone seems to have, not in superior to anyone else, but in exclusive within itself. And they say it's kind of like alcoholism. You've got to be here, you've got to live it, you've got to see it to know what it is, and I know what they're talking about. And how good you people have been to Florence and myself, and how grateful we are. And we've never been to Virginia before, and then all the nice people here, like Don and Jean, and they had to get up early yesterday morning from Washington to drive down to Richmond to pick us up so we wouldn't be waiting in the airport, the terminal there, and come on down here. And then he showed us around town, and we saw the golf course. You wouldn't think there was anything in Blackstone, but I know almost as much about Blackstone as I do Kilgore. And then they took us down to a lovely home where they were staying down there. Was a nice lady there, and she invited us into a home and made us feel good. And we sat out on the porch in the swing, and I haven't sat in the swing in a long time, in the breeze and the calm there, and it just made you feel good. Then we come around here and we saw Julian. He was running around like a Chinaman trying to move a vacant lot, but he was getting, he was just a running, and I was glad to see Julian. And then finally Tom came, and we got to see Tom. We love Tom and Dave down in Texas, and they have meant so much to us. But the gratification that I got out of this trip, that I got to meet Gay, Tom's wife. And what a beautiful experience that was. What a lucky rascal he is, too. And so here, and then as we come on in and meet all of these other people. And I didn't know that I'd know anyone down here. I just thought this was another occasion, you know, and I would meet lots of new friends, which I have. But then you just almost feel at home. I was down in Midland about a little while this summer, about the middle of the summer, on the way out to Odessa, and Hobbs and Marcia Lee is a very good friend of mine, and I love her. And so we stopped at, Tom and myself stopped at the 910 group there in Midland. And here she came in with the cutest little girl you ever saw in all of your life. And I got to meet Dee. I'd met Bud. I didn't know he was married. They don't tell you those things. Dee might have told me where she lived or somewhere, but I wasn't interested in where she lived. She was there. Like that old boy talking in AA, he says, I'm not so much interested in the sweet by and by. It's the here, now, and now that I'm talking about. And so here we're friends. And then I got to see Barney. And Barney had some business down in Texas, and he took the time to call me up. And John had sent me a bath mat, a picture of $100 bill. And Florence took that $100 bill, and now she washes dishes and standing on the $100 bill. She got on a Sears and Roebuck smock, but she's standing on a $100 bill. Now, this is AA, and so we got to see them, and got to see them, and then I got to see Edith. And how nice Edith was when I was over in Durham, and I checked in the hotel there, suing myself, and it was a nice room they gave me. But she said, no, this is not what we want you to have. And I think she must have given me the bridal suite. It was an immense thing, you know, but just to make you feel it good. And then there was Edna. They took us into her home, and we stayed over there at her birthday and brought her friends in that we might meet them, that we might know you and you might know us down here in East Texas and then North Carolina and these things. And these things here. And then we were all worried about Bish and Ruth, and here we walk up in Virginia, and here's Bish and Ruth. Now, of course, we're all sorry they got the house blew away, but they knew they were going to do that when they built it, so, you know, no bad like that. But now you talk about a complete turn in your AA road and the cyclone or this hurricane coming and blowing your house away. That created nothing in comparison. The very fact of last night, just because Bish told her to save him a seat at the dining table, and he was talking and sat with someone else, that cyclone was even a mile affair in proportion to what Ruthie. But she gets over it in these things. So we're very grateful for being here and seeing, and all of you people being so good to us and kind. Now, my name's Burton, and y'all don't give you sobriety dates up here. We do down in East Texas, so I just say I'm an alcoholic, and I've been sober ever since I can remember. And but all this gratitude and these things, I think, can develop gratitude. The gratitude for the little things and being grateful. I think this is our growth. Out in West Texas, they have these little cowboy evangelists, you know, and they go out on the plains there, and they hold these camp meetings. And this preacher was out there, and he was holding one. And so he decided he'd preach a sermon on gratitude. So he preached his sermon on gratitude, and it's customary, like old Julian here, when he gets a crowd like this, he passed the hat. But they weren't a bunch of AAs because the hat come back and didn't have a dime in it. And he said, now, folks, this is what I'm talking about. I'm grateful to get my hat back. So you see, you can be grateful for anything. So here we are gathered as alcoholics and non-alcoholics and relatives and friends and loved ones to better acquaint ourselves with the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if we're going to talk about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, we got to talk about the alcoholic. If you talk about the alcoholic, you got to talk about the non-alcoholic. You got to talk about the big book, the 12 steps, the 12 traditions, our meetings. We got to talk about a power greater than ourselves when we call God. And then that decision had coming up into which is God's part and which is my part. And then we got to talk about one of the most important things that we hardly ever mention, the telephone. How important the telephone is into the lives of we alcoholics. And then greater than that, we can't say that AA was born when we came into the club room, or our sponsor was Bill Wilson. There was someone that had to die that you and I might live. There was someone that had to start Alcoholics Anonymous in these little groups that it might be open when we became ready, that we came here. There was someone that had to be good and kind to another individual and concerned with this other individual, so this individual would know how to love and be concerned when you and I came along. So there are those who went before us. You over in this part of the country a little bit earlier in AA than we are over in Texas. And I'm sure there's quite a number of you here tonight that had that rare and that beautiful privilege of starting the little group as it started into your hometown. I happen to be one of the fortunate kind, not my hometown, but a town that I was transferred to over in Kilgore. And I like to reminisce and go back. And these old-timers, we call them old-timers then, but they were just 1, 2, and 3 years old. We had no one that had any great period of sobriety or any experiences. And our relationship to the big book was that of which we could see with blind faith and says, this will what will happen if you will follow it. My friend Dave here and Sue, I wanted to mention Sue because when we were over in Raleigh, she took us in her home over there and she fed me black-eyed peas and onions and cornbread. Most people want to give me chicken and steak, you know, but I want black-eyed peas and cornbread. But old Dave was quoting here from the big book, says, rarely have we seen a person fail who thoroughly follows our path. I was down in Florida, and I heard the expression down there says, rarely have we seen a man in jail who has thoroughly followed our path. And these little quickies, I like them. And this was the kind of training that these men gave us. Just for a minute, let me picture that little group as we started it there in Kilgore. I was transferred over to Kilgore over there after been sober a little while and got my job back. And there were 3 men going to Longview to the meetings over there, and we decided we wanted a group in Kilgore so that we could bring and talk to our people there and have a group in our hometown. So we formed a little group there. There was no place to go at that particular time. Back in those days, no one believed in us, and we didn't believe too much in ourselves, but we held on to each other and to the big book. And this big book, how important it is into all of our lives. So we found a little place to meet. It was a little log cabin, a Boy Scout hut that didn't have dirt floors, didn't have any window in it. But we had a Coleman lantern. One of the boys, one of the 4, was the manager of a lumber company. So he brought down the nail kegs, and our wife put little cushions on the top of it and little calico dresses around, and that was our chair. And we would sit there, and one of us would be chairman, and we would read from the big book, and we would discuss how it meant, and those things of which we would put into our lives. We talked not about success of AA because there was no success, but we talked about failures. We wanted something that we could put in our lives that would live to die. And then we heard of other groups, and we heard of other people, and we grew, and finally the banker one time, he took an interest in, saw the change in this old boy that was running this lumber company, and he got interested in him and began talking to him. And finally Dick told him where we were meeting, and he says, well, that don't have any windows, is it? And he said, no. He said, well, there's a liquor store that had gone broke there in Kilgore, and the bank had to take it over. And says, if you'll take that building down there, why, you can have it if you'll move it. Well, we didn't have anywhere to move it. He picked up the telephone, called somebody, and they said we could have the land. And so we had us a building. Well, we didn't know how to move it, so we went to this moving man, and we helped him move 3 houses so that he would move our building down on this lot. Now, there never was a general in the world that has won a battle that rode in with more pride in his victory march than 8 of us on top of this building going down the streets of Kilgore and moving it from there. And we had a building. Didn't have any lights, but we had a building. Took us about 6 months to find an electrician that wanted to sober up. But we finally found one. And so we had some lights. And so I went down to the furniture store down there, and I said, I want 12 cane-bottom chairs, and I want to pay you $1 a week. He says, who you want me to charge it to? And I said, Alcoholics Anonymous. Said, who's the president? Said, we don't have any president. He said, well, who is some of the officers? We don't have any officers. Well, who are some of the members? I can't tell you. If they want to tell you, that's all right. Just charge it to Alcoholics Anonymous, and if we stay sober, you'll get your money. And if you don't, you'll have to come and get the chair. He says, hell, I don't even know how to spell it. Just bring me $1 a week. So we had some chairs. Now, this was a big occasion. Oh, this was a great great big occasion. Here we had chairs to sit in. And our wives all came down there, and they brought food and brought the whole family. And we had all of this cake and pie and chicken and ham and a big feed. And then we had meetings that lasted on up until 9:30 and 10, 11 o'clock. And because we had some new cane bottom chairs. And we and many things here that these little groups and the closeness that we kept together. And so these are the things that tied in, that made the basic foundations of our groups today. Your group was started in the same manner. But those old-timers, and what a beautiful philosophy they gave. And there wasn't very many. There's 1, 2, or 3, and we would sit at their feet as they'd come around and talk to us. And they'd tell us many things. They told us to be honest and sincere in our efforts, in all of our endeavors toward what this program meant to life. They told us to do 2 things every day that we didn't want to do, just to get rid of our unselfishness. And so then many other things. And they told us about our morning contract and how vital and how important it was. And said before we make our contract in the morning, push aside all thoughts out of our minds until we are ready, until we can make with the most sincere and honest conviction deep down in our heart that we can ask for help for sobriety that day, and then faith will be given to us that we will know that we will be sober that day. And they told us if our motive was right, and would stand up under the spotlight of Alcoholics Anonymous, it made no difference what the end results came out to be. And they told us if we had an apology to make, never go to bed. Never go to bed if we had an apology to make. And they told us many of these little things. And they told us about the anonymity of our program. If you ever do anything good and somebody finds it out, it don't count. It don't count. And he says there's 2 people we don't want in AA. And that is, I heard and they said. So let's keep those out. And says before you say anything about anybody, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? It might be true, yes. But is it kind? No, it's not kind. Is it necessary? No, it's not necessary. And so those little quickies that we gathered around from the wisdom of these individuals, along with our big book, and they brought us into kind of giving us a basic foundation. And then we picked up these little quickies in our club rooms. All of them good AA talks. One down in Waco about drinking says if you're going to stop drinking, you got to stop drinking. What's up? If you're going to stop drinking, you got to stop drinking. I like that one in Brownwood. It says it's not the falling in the water that drowns you, it's the staying there. And that makes a lot of sense. Oh, and then there was a good one down in Palestine. It says when a peach gets ripe too quick, there's a worm in it. And that has all of it. And one up in Memphis said, I've had just about all of this fun that I can stand. We've got one in our little group in Kilgore down there, and says, if you're dissatisfied with AA, well, all your problems, your grief, and your trouble will gladly be refunded to you at the end of the meeting. So what are we coming for? What are we coming for? So here the basic foundation seems to be predominating into the lives of other individuals through their experience, and they bring it to us. But they're bringing it down to a very peculiar type of individual. If we're going to talk about the alcoholic, and if we talk about Alcoholics Anonymous, we've got to talk about the alcoholic. Now we hear that the alcoholic is far above the average intelligent individual, that we're brilliant, we're smart, we're more tactful, we're more everything. In fact, I've even heard us called God's chosen people. Of course, you never hear this outside of a club room, but we hear this in the club room all the time. Well, there's some smart people and there's some brilliant people in AA, and there's some dumb ones like me, too. But here we find the alcoholic. I don't know whether we were born upside down or not, but we do everything backwards. We go to the table, we're sleepy. We go to bed, we're hungry. We go to the funeral, we want to be the corpse. If we go to the wedding, we want to be the bride. If we ever do anything good, it's at the wrong time. And if we ever get caught, it's not our fault. Like this old boy is driving down the highway, and this cop stopped and found this bottle in the car. He said, "What's this?" Said, "It's water." He opened it up and smelled of it, and he said, "Man, this is not water, this is wine." He looked up and he says, "Lord, you've done it again." So we're talking about a very funny type of individual when we're talking about the alcoholic. Now, the only difference between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic is that we alcoholics know what's the matter with us. And so here we find two sick people. We find the alcoholic who is afflicted, and we find the loved one who is affected. And the one who is affected gets just as emotionally sick as the one who is afflicted. That's the reason I love Al-Anon so well. My friend Horace Fort used to say that when a team of horses is going down the road and one falls down and it's helped back to its feet, it's necessary to rearrange the harness on both horses. And then the sadness of all of this is there is no worldly help. There is no worldly help. And the three phases of our disease, of which we look upon alcoholism as the disease, and this is so necessary. We've got to look in our big book states. And I wish everybody would read the big book. If you read the big book, I wouldn't have to be up here talking and nobody else. But you won't read the big book. Yet the big book tells us how to get sober and to stay sober. It tells us who God is, where we can find Him, and how He can fit into our lives. It gives us a clear understanding of what spirituality is and how effective it is into the lives of us and others. It tells us what humility is. It tells us our relationships to God, our relationships to life. It tells us what an alcoholic is and what alcoholism. But we won't read it. We'll read everything else. We'll read Fosdick, Emmett Fox, or You're Like I Am. Get some book that you don't think some other drunk has read, so you can be smarter than he is, you know. And you'll read that, but we won't read the big book. We're like the little boy that went to his daddy and says, "Daddy, I want to ask you a question." He says, "Go ask your mother." He says, "I don't want to know that much about it." So we find ourselves that we are sober, and this is just about as far as we want to go. So the big book has become a symptom. Yet the most beautiful words that I have ever read, and the most beautiful words that you have ever read, or that you will read if you will put the effort to it, are on the bottom of the page of the new book of page 83 and the top of page 84. 96 in the old book and 83 in the new. It's the 14 promises of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not going to quote all of them, I can, but I'll give you the first one. And it says there in big print that we will find you freedom and you happiness. We will find you freedom and you happiness. And number 14, it says that we will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Not do for ourselves. The rebellious attitude of the word alcoholic. I don't know whether the word alcoholics any more popular now than it was then. I know I got kind of smart after I sobered up a little bit, and I went back to my sponsor and I said, "Doc, I don't know whether I'm an alcoholic or not." And he says, "Well, I don't either. But I'll tell you one thing, you're either a drunk or an alcoholic or a mental case." Well, when you bring it down into that don't give you too much decision. I'm kind of like that old boy that went to work in that factory, and they put in this insurance policy, and he wouldn't sign it. Everybody else signed it. And so the boss tried to get him to sign it, and the superintendent. Finally, the president flew in there and said, "Get me that man that's holding up this insurance policy." So he got him in there and said, you take this contract and sign it to get your tools and get out. Well, he just got his pen, went ahead and signed it. He says, "Now, why didn't you sign that 2 weeks ago?" He said, "Well, nobody ever explained it to me like this, you know." Nobody had ever explained it to me like this. So I didn't know what an alcoholic was. I had to be one to belong to Alcoholics Anonymous, and nobody else would have me. So I became a Me Too alcoholic. Everybody that gets up says, "My name is so-and-so, I am an alcoholic," I'd say, "Me too." And that's what the big book says. By often repeating these acts, they become habitual and become natural to us. And so it's just as natural for me to be an alcoholic as it is to breathe. But we get our program all mixed up. We get it up with religion. We get it mixed up with getting good when we're trying to get well. It's all right to get good if you want to get good. But get good later on. Let's get well before we get good. I think I told them down in Durham down in Port Arthur, this old boy that worked for the railroad. And he got fired for Rule G. And so the AA's got a hold of him, sobered him up, got him AA, and got his job back. And he was real happy. He liked to ride on trains, and so he got him a pass from Houston out to El Paso after the first payday. And this is the first time he'd ever ridden on a train sober, and it was something. Had him a Pullman and everything. So come nighttime, while he prepared himself to go to bed, and went back and pulled open the curtain, and here's two of the best-looking women he ever saw in all of his life. He scratched his head and was deeply embarrassed and said, "Now listen, girls, I joined Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm trying to live a decent and an upright life. Now, one of you girls got to find another place to sleep. So you see, we are not trying to get good. We just want to be our." We just want to be, I started to say our normal selves, but I don't like to use the word normal since old Doc Miller told me what a normal person was. Says a normal person is a man that'll buy his little boy a whistle and then slap the hell out of him for blowing it. So I don't want to be normal. So I just want to be our natural self. So hear an understanding of these things. And the creation, and this, when we talk about this helplessness, this hopelessness, we get sick on the inside. Now, this goodness comes, because we get it all mixed up with religion and church. But AA is not a religious organization. Neither is a non-religious organization. If you're a Methodist, it'll make you a better Methodist. If you're a Baptist, I know it'll make you a better Baptist. If you're an atheist, it'll make you a better atheist. It'll make you better what you are, because it is a program of self-improvement. And the only treatment that is known today for the disease of alcoholism is a spiritual and a mental growth. A spiritual and a mental growth. A spiritual and a mental growth comes from the inside. It comes from the inside because alcoholism is a personal disease. It wasn't those jails that I had been in. It wasn't the jams that I had gotten myself in, or the conditions there, that caused me to react, to create an idea of stopping drinking. It was hurting people when I didn't want to hurt them. It was lying when I didn't want to lie. It was trying to justify myself when I knew my justification was just as phony as I was, and they weren't any more acceptable to them than they were to myself. And so I said, if these things are alcohol is causing me to do these things, then I will stop. And then came the greatest disappointment in my whole life when I found out that I couldn't stop. And here my drinking changed, my drinking pattern changed. No longer was I taking a drink to get drunk. I was taking a drink to sober up, to steady my nerves, to write my name, to walk, to talk, to try to produce the responsibilities that I knew that were expected upon me. And I would drink the minimum amount of which I could possibly get by upon. and many times taking more than I anticipated, and find myself again in that intoxicated condition. And I didn't want to be in that intoxicated condition, and I didn't want to see that disappointment on Florence's face or on her mother's face of whom we were living with. And many at night I would sit out on an bank and watch that little light into the window 10:30, 11, 12, or 1 o'clock, waiting for the light to go out. And then after it going out, waiting another 30 minutes, and then going in, undressing, and falling into bed myself. But invariably waking up and hearing those little tears on that pillow next to mine. And me lying there with all the stiffness that I could rake and scrape in this old body of mine for fear that she might know that I was awake and listening to her crying. Saying over and over to myself, my God, why can't I quit? Why can't I quit? Certainly here was all the determination, all the eagerness, all the willingness, everything that I could rake and scrape in this old body of mine, never to touch another drop. Only to wake up in the morning and do the same thing over again. And as I walked into my father's business one morning, and he took one look at me and saw the condition that I was in, and he picked up the telephone and he called a bootlegger and he says, "You're killing me and you're killing my boy." And he put his head down on his elbows and he cried like a baby. And me standing there with the love that I had for this grand person, and knowing the heartaches that I'd caused him, saying this same thing over and over again, my God, why can't I quit? Why can't I quit? But within myself I knew I couldn't stop, and there was but one thing for me to do, and that was to go out and grab that bottle and drink myself into hell and into blackness to where I could get it out of my mind. So you can see how grateful I am here tonight when Alcoholics Anonymous came to me and said, "You're sick and you're not sorry. And you have what we call the disease of alcoholism." And my sponsor told me the thing that saved my life and the one that saved yours, and the message that we can carry to the world today. Because he said, from this moment on, it will not be necessary for you to ever take another drink as long as you live if you don't want to. And I can show you how. And I can show you how. There's many, many things that entry and the life-changing devices that God seems to bring into this portion of our lives. The program of Alcoholics Anonymous, as we approach our meetings and we hear and we read from the big book, and we read from the big bits of purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the early part of the big book, it says the simple purpose of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is to show us what we can do when we enlist the aid of a power greater than ourselves. Anything in the world about drinking whiskey. Said the simple purpose of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is to show us what we can do when we enlist the aid of a power greater than ourselves. In the latter part of the big book, it says Alcoholics Anonymous, the purpose is to fit ourselves for service, for God and man, for God and man. As I sit there and give up on Mother's living room on February the 21st, 1947, there was no plausible alibi that I could give myself for the condition that I was in. Even in the wildest imagination, I could not even create any worldly thing that would bring me back into the realm of the world of which I knew that I had lost. There was nothing for me to cry out to except a God. I didn't know whether it was my father's God or whether it was a God that I'd heard in Sunday school and church. But I said, "God, I will do anything if you'll help me get sober and stay sober." And he heard me. But God didn't come to me and give me sobriety because I asked it. He gave me sobriety because I asked it. And he didn't pick you and I out of the 8 million alcoholics in our nation today and says, "I'm going to give this to you, but I'm not going to give that to that one over there." No. I think that he gave us our sobriety because we asked him. And we were sincere and we were honest. And we were willing to do those things of which we could help him in his world and with his children. And so here he gave us. But he doesn't just turn us around and with sobriety and say, "Here is your life." There are many, many factors here. And I like we talk about a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience, but a spiritual awakening. And awakening, I like this because it means it has been on the inside all the time. And we wake up and an understanding comes. Something unlocks a door, and it gives us new ideas. And we go to the meeting and we hear these things here, and people are good to us. And we have been very far from being good to ourselves. The condemnation of which we could see no good. But it isn't our love for the group as we go there the first time. It is because we have no love, but it is their love and their goodness towards us. And they pat us on the back, and they see something good in us, and they say, you can make it, and they have a little faith. And we say, these people see something good in me, and they believe in me. Maybe if I look, maybe I will find some too. Very small, but maybe it's there. And we reach down and grab that little piece of white velvet that God has never let us soil. And this is the start. And this new way of life, and I like to call these gifts, and I look upon them as four, as the tools that God gives us to build our new life. Because God does not give us sobriety, He gives us ways of which we can maintain our sobriety. He does not give us comfort, but He gives us tools to make us comfortable. He does not give us the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, but He gives us the principles of which we can apply into our lives and formulate a life that will eventually lead to the utopia and the basic end of which Alcoholics Anonymous leads. So I like to call these four tools that He gives us. And He says you can have these tools and you can put them in a box and you can maintain your sobriety, yes. Or you can take them and build a shanty, or you can take them and build a modern home, or you can take them and build a mansion, all in according to the principles of which you take from the experiences of those first 100 men and the procedure they outlined in the big book for you to follow into your life, And this first tool, as I say, was sobriety. And He gave me this because I asked Him. And I asked Him, and it had to come through another individual. This is the secret of the whole thing. As I mentioned a moment ago, alcoholism is a personal disease. And being personal, we've got to have another person. We can't have a bottle, we can't have a philosophy, we can't have a pill, we can't have a book, we can't have a hospital, we can't have any. We've got to have another person. Physical conditions can be remedied, but they are nothing permanent. Mental conditions and emotion fluctuate. But when we get to the third soul, the soul sickness, there is but one medicine. There is but one treatment. And this treatment comes from the voice and the sound of another human being talking into our heart. And this is the only treatment of which we have to rely. So people become important. So in 45 minutes, someone knocked on Mother's door. And the man said, my name's Doc Black, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm from Palestine, Texas. I understand that you're having some trouble with your drinking. Would you like to get well? This question had been asked me lots of times, but there was something different about this man. It wasn't a curiosity that he had driven 65 miles to see a man that he had never heard of before in his life, or that he, with his human love for the individual in misery, was so great. No. There was something magnetic. There was something drawing to this man. And I said the only words of which I could say, yes, sir, I sure do. And he said, come out on the swing. And I went on the swing, and he began talking about his life. And I thought he was talking about mine. But he told me nothing I didn't know, because I'd experienced these same things. I'd seen sincerity in people, and I saw sincerity in this man, but this was nothing new. But this power, this something that was drawing me to him, that was holding me in the vice that just wouldn't let me go, because I would have followed that man to the end of the world. And he said, will you go to a meeting? And I said, yes. And they'd just started this little beating down in Thailand. We went down there, and there was 8 men, and I saw 4 of them I knew and 4 I didn't. And I saw something different into these men. And we went through that meeting. And then we went on up into the hotel room, and he spent the night, and we talked before 5 o'clock. He told me more about his life, and then Doc began talking about God. Well, I knew he was going to talk about God, and I'd been evading the question because I'd heard it in the group meeting down there. So I said, Doc, I don't know anything about God. He says, it don't make any difference whether you know anything about God or not. He knows all about you. But in the morning, not now, in the morning, if you still have this same sincere desire to stay sober, I want you to remember that there are going to be two words that's going to be more important to you than all the rest of the words of the whole English language. That is the word please and the word thanks. And he says, in the morning, not now, in the morning, if you still have this same sincere desire to stay sober, you go into the quietness of yourself and you say the word please, and God will put into your mouth and into your heart the things He wants you to say. On February the 22nd, 1947, I went into the bathroom and I said the word please, and the words came out that morning that have come out every morning since then. Please, God, with your help, I'll not take a drink today. Please, God, with your help, I'll not take a drink today. I didn't ask God to keep me sober. I didn't ask Him to take my compulsion away. I said, please, God, with your help, I'll not take a drink today. Tom is kind of like that preacher, you know, that says every time I pray to the Lord to send me a turkey, well, sometimes I get one and sometimes I don't. But he says every time I pray to the Lord to show me where that turkey is, says I get one every time. So we have got something. This sobriety is our baby. God, the Salvation Army, Alcoholics Anonymous, is not going to keep a man or a woman from taking a drink if they want to drink. So here was my first gift. And God says, I will give you this gift today. And if you're grateful for it, then more will be added. If you abuse it, all of it will be taken away. All of it will be taken away. And the second tool comes in the form of friends. Friends like I told you about here, as we have seen here, and how nice you are, and how many that we're going to carry in our hearts and our minds, and back into Texas over there, where your names will be planted in seed into their minds, and maybe one of these days they'll get to meet you too and be happy like we are. Friends. More friends than we've ever known in all of our lives. You can't hardly name a town in Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and, well, one town in Virginia now, and Oklahoma. I can't name you 4 or 5 people I'd go and live with the rest of my life, and they come to my heart. Friends. Florence and myself were talking last Christmas. She had a box of Christmas cards, and she sent out 9. We didn't get a one. This was 22 years ago. This past Christmas, we got a whole bushel basket full. Friends everywhere. Why? Because of how important they are. How important we have to have another person. So God gives us this second tool, and He gives us these friends, and He gives us in the same proportion of which He gives us our sobriety. If you are grateful for these friends, more will be added. If you abuse them, all of them will be taken away. All of them will be taken away. The third and fourth tool comes in the form of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the purpose of life in AA. And this comes, you see, we are alcoholics, yes, but we're humans also. And I was no different from anyone else. I'd got my brains out of hock, you know, and my job back, and I was pretty smart, and everything good was happening to me. And I was just eating this up. They wanted me to do this, but I was getting more petting, and I didn't want to stop. So I went down to Palestine one day. And the old doc says, Crawford, I got some news for you. Well, everything good had been happening to me. I'm telling you, they were calling me up, and how about coffee, and were picking me up and taking me to the meetings. I never got so much attention in all of my life. And for the first time in my life, I began to believe in everything. There's so many spooky things were happening, and I didn't have anything to do with it. I had to believe it. Not always believed in Horatio Alger, you know. I always read those stories because they come out successful in the end. And the stories in the back of the big book, I always read the last pages first. I wanted that success. And in these fairy stories, I have a beautiful imagination. That I can, this creation within my mind, I can build some of the most beautiful worlds and just move in there with some of you. And, oh, man, there's just nothing like it, and it's real. And so here are these fairy tales, but my favorite one was about this little fairy. And she had a little gold ball, and she just loved this little gold ball. And one day she was out in the yard and she was playing, and it rolled out of her hand down into a pond of water, and she knew that she had lost this little gold ball. And she just cried like her heart would break. And she was down on her knees and weeping so she just cried like her heart would break. And she was down on her knees and weeping so painfully there, and this little frog came up and he had this little gold ball in his mouth. And she says, "Oh, little frog," says, "I'm so grateful you saving my gold ball. I will grant any wish that you desire." And the little frog said, "It's always been my wish that I might sleep on your pillow one night." She said, "This is the easiest of all wishes." And so she took the little frog and put it on the pillow that night. And the next morning she woke up, and here was a great, big, handsome prince. You know, she never could get her mother to believe that story about that frog. I didn't believe it either, but I believe those things now. There's so many spooky things here that's happening, and everything good was happening to me. So old Doc said, "Crawford, I got some news for you." I says, "What is it?" He said, "Your honeymoon's over." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "It's time for you to come in and join us and go out and pick up these others." Well, I wasn't quite ready, and besides, I was in Palestine, and they didn't know anything about that up in Tyler. I didn't know this antenna had a long reach. But come Friday night, this old boy that always picked me up, I saw him coming. I walked out to the curb. He just drove right on by. Hell, he didn't even look over. And I said, "Oh, that's kind of funny. He's going to go get somebody else." Our meeting starts at 8 o'clock, and about 8:30, I was pretty well convinced he wasn't coming back. So then my old alcoholic mind began to wander. I knew there was something phony about this goody-goody fellowship, brotherly love organization, and then I remembered my first night. They said, "You are the most important man here. It is through you that we are staying sober." Well, I thought this was a lifetime handle that they was giving me. I didn't know this was a one-night stand, you know. So I said, "I'll get even with them. I'll quit, and they'll all get drunk. I'll teach them out." And I quit. And it's only by the grace of God that I didn't drink. But I was the most miserable soul for 5 weeks that you ever saw in all of your life. Every Saturday morning, going around to each one. "Who was there? What did y'all talk about? Have you got any new ones? Do you need me to do anything?" Just lying through my teeth why I wasn't there. They knew why I wasn't there. And finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I climbed up those 51 steps there at 214.5 North Broadway, and I sat down right on the front row. They was all back at the back end there laughing and talking, nobody listening, and everybody having fun, and my eyes was glued on that floor. There never was a sheep-eating dog that was any lower than I was. And we had 12-step calls. Everybody wanted to make a 12-step call. We just went all together. But we had one rule: always go in pairs, never alone. Go in pairs. One to talk, one to pray. And so the phone rang, and I knew it was a call. And I'd never had a call, and I wanted that call worse than anything I had ever wanted in all of my life. And old McFarland turned around about that time and said, "Crawford, there's a call here at 914 East Line. Do you want it?" I says, "I sure do." I jumped out of that chair, didn't ask anybody to go with me. I think I ran practically all the way down there. I walked up to the door, never had been there before, and a little girl came to the door, and I said, "Where's your daddy?" And she said, "He's on the back porch." Well, I knew I had the right house. So I walked through the hall, and sure enough, here was the old iron bed. It was a mattress without any sheets on it. It was a pillow without any pillowcase. And here this old boy rolled it and tossed it where I'd been 100 times. This was my first 12-step call. I didn't know what to say. I asked him that silly question, how do you feel? He said, I'm sick. And I said, I know you're sick. But he said, you don't know how sick I am. But I did. I knew every pain he had in his body. I knew every ache and every hopeless thought that he had in his mind. And I sat down there on the side of the bed. And I began to relate experiences into my life when I was just exactly like that. And this old boy who hadn't been able to raise his head on his elbows for 3 days, I looked around in a few minutes and he was sitting on the side of the bed beside me. And I said, do you realize what I do? And he says, I think I do. And I said, I'm going uptown. And when I said I'm going, he grabbed me, and I couldn't convince him that I was going to leave and then come back. And I said, yes, I am going, but I'm coming back. But the reason I am going is I want you to know and to talk to this power that has given you the strength to rise out of this bed. You who have been so sick that you couldn't raise your head on your elbow. And I went away. And I came back in about 20 or 30 minutes, and not only had he gotten off the bed, but he was in the kitchen scrambling some eggs. I pushed the eggs aside, and I got the coffee pot, and we never touched those eggs, but over a porcelain table and 2 cups of coffee. He on one side, and I sat on the other. But we didn't talk about the things that created all the disturbance in our lives, or the humor, or the sorrowful things that happened to our drinking experience. We talked about those things that we wanted to be. We talked about wanting back into life. We wanted in somehow to try to be that person that our wives thought that we were when she married. Or maybe in some small degree be the person that our fathers and mothers had prayed that we would be when we grew up. We wanted to love. We wanted to be loved. We wanted friendship. We wanted back into the world. And as I find here, as I hear through my arrogancy and my ego and my pride, just these few little months with all these beautiful things and people better to me than I'd ever been treated in all of my life. And but somebody threw me a curve that I didn't like, and I quit, and I went back into that old muck that I had been praying and crying and hoping and trying to get out of for 8.5 years, and I like to have lost the most beautiful and precious thing in all of my life. And then as I remember sitting there on the side of the bed and taking the experiences up to my life and transferring them into the heart, into the soul of another individual with compassion and with strength was given to him, and he rose. And I found my purpose in life. And I found my purpose in life. And I found how to give. And I found also that the giving here, those as we receive, how precious and how grateful we are and how numerous we like to appraise it and build it up to the sky high. But there is no comparison into the joy and the contentment and to the happiness and to that of which when we give. And what a small amount of time that we spend in giving to others. And this is a few minutes and I'll close. And this is where I want to talk about the telephone. In our little group there, we didn't have any money. It cost 75 cents a month, so I had the phone Alcoholic Anonymous listed in my home phone, so no call would ever go unanswered. And that phone rang more between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning than it did any other time. But always when I'd hear it ring, and Florence would get up and answer it, and I'd say, thank you, God, because here was an opportunity to pay back my debt of gratitude for a man leaving his profession and leaving his office and his home and his business and driving 65 miles, that I might have a little happiness. And so here, this phone rang one morning about 4 o'clock. And the voice on the other end says, I understand that you can get drunks out of jail. I said, well, I got a few out, got myself out a few times. And I said, well, this is over in Henderson. That's about 19 miles from Kilgore. I said, you got somebody over there? And he said, yeah. And I said, let's go get him. He says, now? I said, sure. You and I in a nice, comfortable room, and he's over there in a strange town in a cold jail, and he's afraid and lonesome, and he needs help, and let's go get him. You want me to come by and pick you up, or you pick me up? He says, I'll be by your house. But you know, sometimes we think that we are doing 12-step work. We're the one that is staying sober. We're doing all of these things. We forget about this power greater than ourselves and what part God has to play. Because you know, these sheriffs are not the happiest people in the world to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get a drunk out of jail. So somebody's got to talk to him. And so here we kind of like that lady, you know, that thought she was a wonderful cook until she realized one day how much work the fire did. And then so here, the Lord, He did His part over there, and He talked to the sheriff, I know, because when I got over there, I hollered up, and old Herman said, yeah, I know what you want, put on some coffee, and I'll be down there in a minute. He came on up, and we went on up to see this old boy, and he wasn't in too bad a shape. He knew what town he was in, knew what he was in there for, hadn't run over anybody. I said, Herman, this man lives up in Dallas, and says, give him to us, and I'll take him over home. Florence will fix our breakfast, and I'll put him on the bus, and I've got some friends in Dallas, and they'll take care of him. You won't see him anymore. And he did just that. So I brought him over, and Florence had our breakfast ready, and at 8 o'clock I put him on the bus, and I called old Bill Henderson up in Dallas, what time the bus is going to get there, and he called me back and says, I got him. Well, everything was all right. I was up in Dallas many times in the following year, and I saw him 3 or 4 times, getting along fine, always asked about him. But about a year later, I was up there, and a lady came up to me and says, you don't know me, do you? And I says, well, in a way I do, in a way I don't. That's about as close as I can come to telling the truth. And she says, do you remember getting a man out of Henderson jail? And I said, oh, I get lots of people out of Henderson jail. She says, well, do you remember so-and-so? I said, sure, he's a friend of mine, lives in my hometown. Says, that man is my brother. And the man that y'all got out of jail is my husband. And I just want to thank you for 11.5 months of the most wonderful portions of all of our lives. All of our lives. What a small amount of time. Of course, I didn't give her 11.5 months. But God let me see this 11.5 months in her faith. He let me be an instrument that I might plant the seed and give me this feeling on the inside. And each one of our calls are like this, and I'll tell you one more. And this phone rang again one morning about this same time, and I just come from down on the coast, and I was in the living room undressing. I don't usually undress in the living room, but this particular morning I did, and I was leaning over, sitting by the side of the phone, untying my shoe, and the phone rang. And it was a voice of distress. And I said, take your time, I'll still be here. In a few seconds, she says, of course, I'm not calling about myself. I'm calling about my husband. I don't know whether you can do any good or not. Says he's already home, but he's passed out. But the day's payday, there's no money in his pocket. Our rent is long past due. I have 2 small children. There's no groceries in the house. I'm at the end of life rope. I've got to have some help. I said, do you have any coffee in the house? And she said, yes. And I said, put a pot of coffee, and I'll be over there in a few minutes. And I drove over there, and I'll call her Mary, and Mary was standing at the door, and one of the little girls was holding on to the skirt. And as I went into the living room, I saw this other little girl over here on the couch. But I looked over here, and old John was already passed out on the bed, so there was nothing I could do for John. But again, over a porcelain table and 2 cups of coffee, Mary on one side and I on the other. Here's where God gave me an opportunity to talk about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the disease of alcoholism. And again, I began to relate experiences into my life that I thought might parallel along with John. I saw the hopelessness in Mary's face because I'd seen it in Florence's face for many, many years. And as I sat there and talked, I saw Mary kind of relax, and then Mary began to talk. And she says, this home has not always been like this. So some 16 years ago, John and myself were married, and this was a happy marriage. Said John drank a little, but we paid no attention to this. 2 children came into our lives, and this was added blessed. I saw something kind of pulling John away from me, but I thought maybe it was my added years of married life or my attention to the children. until I saw something grab him and pull him completely away, and she pointed over there and says, "That's not my John lying there on that bed." Said, "John don't want to do what he's doing to me and to these children. Something's got a hold of him, and I don't know what it is, and I've got to have some help." About 6 o'clock, old John roused up, and I saw he was awfully sick, and I says, "John, do you want to get well?" He said, "More than anything in the world." I said, "Will you go to our state hospital?" He says, "I'll go anywhere." But at that particular time, we only had 7 beds for the men and 5 for the women, and it covered that whole vast area of East Texas. And many times we had to wait 4 and 5, sometimes 6 weeks before we could get our parties in. But here's where God intervened again. Because at 8 o'clock I called Dr. Jackson's office, and his secretary answered the phone. And I told her the situation. She says, "Isn't this a coincidence? There's a man standing right here that's checking out. Will you have your party here today?" And I says, "I'll have him there in an hour." And I went back and I told John what clothes to get, and Mary started to get up, and I said, "Mary, let John get those if he can. I want to talk to you." And John went on into the other room, and I said, "What are you going to do, Mary?" And she says, "I don't know." I said, "Don't you have a home?" And she said, "Yes, but I can't go there anymore." And I said, "Why, Mary?" She said, "For a long time now they won't let me mention John's name into their home, and so I just had to quit going." I said, "Mary, don't you know that grandfather and that grandmother's heart is bleeding for these grandchildren just like yours is bleeding for John? Something has got to break down this barrier of pride in we mortals' hearts to where God can come in and tell us what to do. So let me take John down there, and I'll carry you to their house, and if they don't want you, you can come to ours." So I took John down to Rust, and I came back, and I got Mary and the 2 children, and we drove about 40 miles north of Kilgore up into Upshur County. And we drove up to this country home. This grandmother didn't recognize this little red pickup that I was driving, but it didn't take her long to recognize those grandchildren, because she didn't wait for them to come down the steps. She jumped off of that porch and ran and grabbed them with an embrace that I hope I'll never forget. And then Mary walked up, and there was another. And finally I walked up, and I was introduced, and she grabbed me, and she says, "Thank God. All of my prayers have been answered. All my prayers have been answered." I walked up on the porch, and I met the sternness of this father. And I recognized it in his face. But here's where God intervened again, because it was about noontime, and they asked me to partake of this fine country meal. And here again I had the opportunity to talk about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the disease of alcoholism. And again I related experiences into my life that I thought might parallel along with John. I hadn't been talking very long, and I heard the lips of this father, and he said, "Mother, maybe we've been too harsh on John. Maybe we've been too harsh on John." I knew that God had taken over, and it's time for me to take my departure. I went away, and in 28 days they called me and said, "John's ready to come home." And I said, "I'll be after him in the morning." And I went back to this Upshur County home, and I went up there, and it was a different side of which I had left. Mary was happy, the children were happy, and the grandmother and the grandfather. We talked a little bit, and then Mary and myself kind of walked away from the house. And I said, "Mary, John's coming home tomorrow. What are you going to do?" "No," she says, "I'm going home. I'm going back with you." I said, "I'm so glad you said that, Mary. If you go pack your things, we'll take off." And she said they'd been ready for 2 weeks. So Mary and the children themselves drove back down to our house, and there was 8 or 10 AAs and their wives, and we had coffee and cake and good fellowship. Then we all went over to Mary's house. The wives kind of helped Mary straighten up the house, and we men did what was necessary to stay out of work, but everybody had a good time. And finally, about 2 o'clock, an old boy says, "I got to go home," but nobody wanted to go home. And then, but he says, "I've got to go to work in the morning at 5:15, so let's all join hands." And we all joined hands in a little circle. And we gave thanks to God for what had been given to us and our families and our loved ones. But I think deeper down on the inside of us, we gave a greater thanks that God had given us the opportunity that we might carry this happiness within us and give this to another, that they too might be happy like we. I believe I was closer to God that night than I've ever been in all my life. Of course, you know the story. I went down the next morning, and I got John. John came back home. He got his job back. He came on into AA. I know about 150 homes around East Texas today that mentions John's name in their benediction every night because John gave to them what had been given to them. I saw that home reunite. I saw those two little girls graduate from high school. Those of you who saw the Kilgore Rangerettes in 1957 would have seen those two little girls. After school, they moved over into Louisiana. And about 4 years later there, this phone rang again. And it was Mary this time. And she told me that John had passed away. And I said, Mary, I'll be there just as fast as I can. And I drove over there. I couldn't think of what to say, but there's one thing that I forgot. I forgot that God had been there before I. Because as I walked up on the porch, Mary came to the door and she says, Burton, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? God gave us 9.5 years of happiness. 9.5 years of happiness. Says, you know what the neighbors did last night? They kept the light burning all night long for fear that I might think that I was alone. But says, I'm not alone. There's a part of John and Joe and Jim and Mary, and she went on to mention all of those things. And she said, you know of all the wonderful group that we have here upon earth, don't you know that they have a marvelous group there in heaven? And how proud John's going to be when he goes to this meeting and he gets up and he says, my name is John, I am an alcoholic. Where can we get more understanding of life? The bottle has long been passed aside. The destruction in those things that we thought was tearing down the very basic structure of life turned out to be the most precious gems of all. Our experiences into life that led us into a different direction. And then greater as we seek in the serenity and peace of mind and comforts and these things of which we want here upon earth. As we meet and gather here tonight, so they're meeting and gathering up there tonight and they're looking at us. I'm getting kind of lonesome for that group. I want to go there. My sponsor's up there. Icky's up there. John's up there. Dick's up there. Many that you know are up there, sitting around just like they did as we sat around here in our early days, and they came and we sat at their feet and listening, and this little voice on the inside, and they says, here is our reward. Here is where there is no pain, there is no sorrow. Here is where serenity and peace of mind and all of these things of which you are seeking says, this is your reward. This is your reward. And as we join our hands in this worldly fellowship, as we call it, of men and women to solve a common problem and help other alcoholics to recover, somewhere along the line, our hand is taken out of this worldly fellowship and slipped into a higher fellowship. And I'm like old Charlie when he said, God is no longer my master but my companion. And the adversities of life I accept because I realize they are the rungs of the ladder of which I must climb for spiritual perfection. If God has granted me sobriety today, He has granted me the greatest gift that could be bestowed upon me or upon any other alcoholic. That the philosophy of life or the philosophy of AA without God is like a beautifully constructed automobile without any fuel. You can't go anywhere. And how I can remember when my name was mentioned as to how I was working this program, the men used to turn their backs rather than say what I was doing. But when I hear my name mentioned now, I see a smile come on their face and they say, oh, Charlie, sure, he's getting along fine. He's found himself. But what I wish I could get them to understand, that it isn't myself that I found, but it is God. The simple purpose of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is to show us what we can do when we enlist the aid of a power greater than ourselves. If you don't believe this program will work, try it. If you don't believe God will help you, ask Him. Thank you.